Yeah, the lecture is called Looking at the Great Number Through Austrian Glasses, Hans Hollein's exhibition at the 1968 Milan Triennale. So in 1968, the Austrian architect and artist Hans Hollein was asked to curate the Austrian Pavilion for the 14th Triennale in Milan. This event brought together architecture and product design and focused on how they work together within industry. The title of the overall exhibition theme that year was to be The Great Number. It was intended to address a growing disenchantment within modernity that was manifesting itself through global issues such as overpopulation, mass production, mass waste, increased mobility, as well as social and psychological alienation. And these topics have become increasingly urgent during the post-war years. On top of this, the individual pavilions were to focus on the concept of environment as an architectural artifact. The exhibitions were to be spaces where visitors could engage and become involved. And because of this, the event that year drew the interest of fringe groups not usually engaged with the Triennale. And this exhibition opened on the 30th of May and was to run for 6 weeks, closing on the 10th of July. And here you can see the Palazzo dell'Arte in Milan, where the event took place. So following the overarching brief, Hollein's response was to create an action environment, and he called it the Austriennale, making a joke between Austria and the Triennale. And his idea was to address the problems arising from the post-war globalized world within a specific local Austrian context. This is really important. He created here a surreal architectural and interactive environment in which experimentation and decision-making were part of the participants' physical and psychological experience. And these could be applied and tested within legal and ethically tenable limits. Aside from this, it was also important that the products of the Austrian industry, as well as the country itself, were put on display. That was part of the sort of the framework of I guess, the funding of the whole exhibition from the Austrian side. And for sure, this was a rather curious brief, and its mixture of trying to respond to counterculture and capitalism at the same time. So the exhibition included the actual production of sunglasses with a large injection molding machine spitting out plastic glasses every 15 seconds. And here you can see this machine. And also the hostess who's sort of gathering up all these glasses that people could go and take. And here's another image of the thing actually installed. So people could watch all this taking place as kind of an action industrial production situation, and then take the glasses with them. And the glasses were meant to illustrate, in this sense, also the great number as mass production. But were also about waste, because they could invariably end up as litter once their interest had worn off and they were discarded. So here you can see from the exhibition catalog, you can see these kind of drawings of the machine, and then here are drawings showing the specifications, very seriously designed by Hans Hollein as well, of the glasses. Here are the people. You can see the people sort of scrambling to get one themselves, and the glasses were red, clear, and red, like the red, white, red of the Austrian flag. And so they were the Austrian glasses through which the world was to be viewed. As an advertisement, it was intentional that the glasses could not be folded up and put into your pocket, and they had to be worn. And so they would move beyond the exhibition into the public realm throughout Milan, in front of the Palazzo dell'Arte, and indeed the cathedral. So the exhibition catalog states both wearing the glasses as well as throwing them away are a means of extension of the small Austrian section into other areas, carrying the message of the Austriennale into the rest of the exhibition, the city of Milan, the world. So this is all very intentional. Because the pavilion had been sponsored by the Austrian industry, a large display of disparate objects was staged in a sort of amphitheater separate from the rest of the action environment. So there were combs and cutlery, radios, hair dryers, candles, and room spray, and they were all on show behind a kind of a plexiglass capsule, waiting patiently to be chosen and consumed. So the visitor could sort of look through this kind of hatch and see them, as they were on display here. They were also, I think, intentionally quite separate from the rest of the exhibition. But the main concept of this exhibition was the corridors of frustration, consisting of a Freudian Kafkaesque experience of a series of identical aluminium doors leading to corridors where the visitors were confronted with a combination of Austrian products and psychological spatial effects. Please note here the emphasis on psychology and surreal narrative as a specifically Austrian product as well. The first was a double corridor with shelves filled like in a supermarket, but at the very end there was an area of waste and debris, and the visitors had to walk through this mess to get to the other side and exit. This space was a direct critique on consumer culture and built-in obsolescence. The second corridor was crowded from top to bottom on both sides with bene lever files made in Austria, designed to facilitate the modern office, making filing easier through uniformity. The installation was also about the obsession to compulsively organize and categorize as well. Austrians are very organized. Another corridor contained a simulated snowstorm. Little balls of styrofoams were blown around behind perspex on either side of this kind of refrigerated passage that we can see on this slide. And the floor was made of a kind of soft white material that you sank into slightly and even squeaked like snow does when you walk through it. And on it. And here again, the snow crystals were symbolic of the great number, but also of individuality. And there was, of course, also an Austrian product, snow being this Austrian product, with the country relying very heavily on the tourist industry and skiing. That was taking off also during the post-war years, especially. So, there was a corridor lined with rubber foam on either side where you had to sort of squeeze yourself through as a simulated overcrowding. And the claustrophobia was intentionally exacerbated by letting people in from both sides of the corridor, forcing you to push yourself past them, as well as this kind of weird foam situation. A further corridor was blocked by a door with 42 identical door handles, and only one actually worked, set somewhere in the middle where it could be reached by children and smaller people. But this was in no way obvious. And so Hollein created holes in the wall on either side that you can see right here. One is for a woman. So you could sort of escape into adjacent corridor as sort of escape routes for those visitors who lost patience or just needed to get themselves out of there because they were feeling claustrophobic once again. And here you can, on this slide, you can see that the door handle that actually works. So the ninth corridor was about the population increase by the year 2000, made evident by the decreasing of the space within the corridor at the rate of the population curve. People could just about fit through, but it was, again, an uncomfortable experience. The next corridor was a stairway leading to nowhere, symbolic of the futility of life and its inevitable dead end. The door on the other side of this passage opened to a kind of closet where there was a microscope to look at the infinitesimally small. And then came a corridor of isolation. Near at the end of the passage, there was a mirror in which the visitor was ultimately confronted with themselves and their own individuality. So the last 6 corridors were empty with circular and oval openings at eye level. And you could just walk back and forth and look who else was there, and very, very close by, but also very separate. And if you wanted to, you could wear the Austrian glasses while you were doing this. So the aesthetics were flashy, contemporary, and pop. The Austria signs were in neon and day glow yellow plexiglass. The floor was cobalt blue carpeting, and so were some of the walls. The doors were precision cut aluminum facing into the exhibition, and painted alpine white with a diagonal red stripe facing the outside. There was certainly nothing rustic or alpine about this pavilion. No ambiance of mountain culture and yodeling. No apple strudel or indeed thigh slapping. There you go. Austria is not showing itself, as it probably still does, in its postcard images, as you can see here, to be sent abroad, or how it was portrayed by the US-American film industry in 1965 by The Sound of Music just a couple of years earlier. Here you go. Not even the hostesses wore the traditional garb. The hostesses were in sexy red, red jumpsuits ready for this pop culture action environment. This was about an Austria that was desperate to reinvent itself. And here you can see the hostesses. But why was this necessary? Why did Austria feel that it had to reinvent itself? The end of the Second World War had created a deep sense of cultural dislocation for Austria. So let's go back. From 1918 to 1955, Austria had been subjected to an obliteration of its meta-narratives, so the big stories that had underpinned its history and its sense of identity. It had lost its empire after World War I and was shrunk down from the population size of about 53 million to just under 7 million. Austro-Hungarian Empire also had approximately 12 different languages, and it was contracted to the area that was confined to the German, mainly to the German language. There were still some bilingual areas that were also always still contentious. From that point on, there was a vast cultural imbalance between the capital of Vienna of 2 million and the Alpine and rural German-speaking population. And this urban-rural imbalance continued throughout the 20th century and even holds true today, I would argue. Then in 1938, Austria became part of the Greater Germany and Hitler's Third Reich. From 1945 to 1955, after World War II and during the Allied occupation, Austria as an independent country did not exist at all. When Austria was reinstated as a nation again, the Cold War had started, and Austria was considered a buffer zone. Understanding the role of religion is also very important. Much of the territories during the Austrian-Hungarian Empire were also within the Holy Roman Empire. In 1968, the year of this exhibition, approximately 88% of the population was Catholic. But like the political and territorial shifts after World War II, Catholicism was going through a massive transformation, with the Second Vatican Council completely restructuring the religious practice and its hierarchies. And I would like to divert here and look a bit closer at how the cultural conditions influenced Hans Hollein and his understanding of architecture and his sort of reinterpretation of this. So he was born in Vienna in 1934 into a family of mining engineers. By 1953, he graduates from the Federal Crafts and Industry in Vienna. 1956, he graduates from the Academy of Fine Art, also in Vienna, and then goes and lives and works in Sweden. 2 years later, in 1958, he receives this Harkness Fellowship to study and travel in the US, where he attends IIT in Berkeley, returning to Austria in 1960, where he starts working as an architect. 1968, he participates in the Milan Triennale. In 1980, he participates in the Venice Biennale that Alan has just mentioned, and 1985, he wins the Pritzker Architecture Prize. So 1934, the year that Hollein was born, civil war raged throughout Vienna, and we can say I'm quite interested in press photography and how this works. And here you can see some of my personal collection of press images of Austria. And on the left-hand side, you can see the Karl-Marx-Hof, this major social housing estate, and how it's become kind of kind of a fortress of the socialist resistance, and it's being attacked from the outside. And on the right-hand side, you can see where a coffee house has become also some kind of sort of barricades for this terrible civil war. So these really Austrian kind of institutions, the city itself becomes part of this. So then 1938, Austria is subsumed as part of Nazi Germany. And here you can see the people are celebrating their country's annexation in front of the Bundeskanzleramt in Vienna on their right-hand side, while on the left-hand side, this is also kind of a press photograph that's also kind of a collage where you can see sort of this part. This is little Austria, this little odd shape that looks a bit like a schnitzel, and it's being subsumed into Greater Germany. And supposedly this has been obviously painted in. People are looking and sort of trying to identify themselves with a bigger thing that they were actually quite keen on. As you can see here, they're celebrating. Moving on quickly, 1938, Austria. This is the end of World War II, and here we can see on the left-hand side, tanks, the Allied tanks rolling through down the Ringstrasse past the Parliament building, and on the right-hand side you can see a square in Vienna that has become a graveyard. And because all the systems had broken down and people were dying and they needed to be buried somewhere, and so there was not the infrastructure to take them to the normal graveyards, and so the actual parks and squares were being used for this. Hollein. So this is a little drawing that I found in Hollein's private archive when I was there a couple of years ago, and it's a picture of it's a little section through a tank, where as a kind of a minimal environment, which is also relevant to Hollein's later research in the 60s. You can see there are some men in here arming this massive gun in this kind of radius that the gun can swing. And also this is, in terms of it's on graph paper, here you can see it from above, also as a kind of an architectural section. So the trauma of all this stuff that had happened since Hollein's birth had obviously left a deep impression on the young Hans Hollein when he was little and drawing this thing. But then also 1958, this was still very evident. And this picture is titled Landscape with Architecture, but it looks like a massive, grave site where these big buildings, these high rises have become kind of monuments for death and, sort of toppled over grave sites. At the same time, he was being exposed to the ideas of space frames, which you can see here and through Konrad Wachsmann. So, as I explained, in 1958, Hollein receives his Harkness Fellowship, and he travels on the SS Flandre, this beautiful ocean liner, from the Havre to New York, and on the left hand you can see from the archive, from the Harkness Fellowship archive, they have a picture of him where he's being told that he's won the scholarship. He's clearly very happy. He's standing there in a slightly oversized suit. And then this is another one of my press images on the right showing the SS Flandre, this beautiful ocean liner. So in the archive letters written at the time, Hollein never mentioned this experience of being on this amazing ocean liner, which I found quite curious. So especially since, we all know that the ocean liner had become this kind of icon of modernity and architecture through Le Corbusier from 1927 onward, and he wrote, Le Corbusier wrote, a great epoch has begun. There exists a new spirit. There exists a mass of work conceived in a new spirit. It is to be met with, particularly in industrial production. Architecture is shifting stifled by custom. The styles are a lie. A style is a unique a unity of principle animating all work of an epoch, the result of a state of mind which has its own special character. Our own epoch is determining day by day its own style. Our eyes, unhappily, are unable yet to discern it. And this is coming from Vers une Architektur. And you can see on that image, this ocean liner, that he's drawing as a city situation, comparing the ocean liner to architecture and in section and sort of tilting it upwards as a building. But something happened, and in 1958, shifting the paradigm of architecture from the glamour and modernity of the ocean liner to the terror and excitement and media circus of space travel. That had started already in 1955. Here you, and then I was sort of, you know, on the right you see a photograph of 1958, where basically the space travel is space race is happening, and where the idea is to take, you know, pictures of the moon, and they're predicting in this photograph that by 1968 there will be possible to take pictures from the moon. It didn't quite happen that quickly. I think it was a year later. But and then on my left-hand image you can see this picture of the America launching the Pioneer Zero in the first of many unmanned lunar missions, and how this becomes kind of a media spectacle. And this is happening curiously while Hollein is in transit on the ocean liner. So he's hearing all about this, so ocean liner is no longer interesting. So the moon itself becomes this kind of new frontier. And here again, in the sort of these press images, you can see artist impressions showing how the moon can be colonized, and it has obviously a very menacing environment. But that light-made plastics and domes and underground prefabricated modules can overcome this, and that you know, you'll be on the moon and looking back to the Earth, and that's on both of these images. So this kind of fantasy as well. Where we're still not at. And then also sort of in terms of sort of materials that are being used. Here you can see this kind of pneumatic tank being pumped up in 1954, London's armored division carrying out military exercise against an enemy known to be equipped with atomic bombs. And you think, how can this pumped up tank actually stave off the Cold War? But, you know, clearly things like this were successful. We didn't have the Cold War; it stayed cold. But then there was sort of the specifically Austrian situation again. This kind of border between Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1954 on this one image that was full of, you know, that looks like a kind of just a landscape and a stubble field, but it's actually underneath are a bunch of landmines. This is a very menacing kind of a landscape, and to counteract this, designers, this company called Svoboda, which was a furniture company that also Hollein worked with, and I'll show you some images I think later. I have some more images. They have these balloons, helium balloons, where they're sending you know, little messages across the Iron Curtain into Czechoslovakia with little notes saying, trying to you know, foster connectivity through this kind of artistic project. And again, but also pneumatics. But at this time also the international style was arriving in Vienna. And here Hotel Intercontinental by Karl Appel arrives in 1964. We can see this near the Stadtpark. And but the young architects were suspicious. And they had just only sort of had the kind of as children experienced kind of this colonizing effect of being part of Greater Germany, and the architectural situations that were happening through that. And then now America was basically coming and saying, you need to build like this, and they're like, do we really, and what are we about? And so they didn't really want to be part of this. So let's move on to architecture, art, and multimedia. So Hollein had become involved in the Galerie St. Stephan already before his departure to the USA. Then when he returned to Vienna in 1960, he re-engaged with the scene also as a forum for his own emerging interdisciplinary practice. This was kind of odd because it was led by this Catholic priest, Monsignor Otto Mauer. And that is another story. He was able to sort of present his own ideas within this forum, and that was sort of the exhibition was called Architektur in German, and then in English, Work in Progress, 1963. And here you can see all kinds of things from Mayan and Mesoamerican temples to iron foundries, oil rigs, space rockets, and significantly also among these totems of there were these totems of the modern world, such as this photograph here of an aircraft carrier that then becomes another topic of Hollein's. The nuclear-powered USS Enterprise had been built in the years while the young Hollein was in America, and it was launched in 1960. And just as Hollein was making his way home to Vienna, and so he's very impressed by the aircraft carrier. So, but also part of the exhibition, and here you can see that on these sort of panels, is a sort of a preoccupation becomes evident with the human body. We can see starving children at the at the top left, the female body, Einstein. Then there's sort of an obsession with technology in Cape Canaveral, with infrastructure, bridges and motorways in the USA, and political actions such as the Second Vatican Council in St. Peter's Cathedral, which we can see here, Bastille in Paris, President Kennedy here on this stage here, in Washington, the slaughter in Algeria, the Kaaba in Mecca, Moscow, etc. And Hollein writes, architecture, expression of the power and the spirit of an era, of an idea. Architecture has been taken out of the hands of architects. Architects have nothing to do with the great buildings of our time. The architecture of today does not yet exist. So also this kind of real kind of frustration with the actual scene of what kind of architecture is being built at the time. Sorry about this. There. He starts getting really preoccupied with his aircraft carrier as a kind of self-contained environment, and creates these collages that from 1967 become part of the MoMA's exhibition collection very quickly, and you can see them there. I was actually quite impressed how small they are. The top image is not as big as it is on our screen. It's about this size, and the smaller images are about this size. They're quite small, actually. And so this combines with Hollein's kind of ideas on communication and media that he becomes also obsessed with, and links in a lot of ways with the aircraft carrier from 1955 to 65. So he has this project that he puts forward for a minimal environment at the Biennale of the Young in 1965. He had, as I sort of explained earlier, he'd lived in Scandinavia in 1955, and they were designing telephones for IM Ericsson, but of course, the telephone itself is this thing in people's houses. The landline was a way that he connected with his family. And when I was interviewing him, he told me that, well, in order for Christmas, for example, to talk to his family, he would actually send them a letter and say, at, I don't know, 5:30 in the afternoon on Christmas Eve, I will be calling you to talk to you to wish you Merry Christmas. And then you talk for 3 minutes, and it was so expensive that something like that, that's all that could really happen. And so Hollein explains a telephone booth is an early prototype of a new architecture which extends a built building with a minimum volume into worldwide dimensions by means of a telecommunications medium. And here's one of my press images showing this also kind of within this kind of connectivity that then finally allows also the kind of rural areas of Austria that alpine with, you know, with the big mountains to connect more easily as well. But also, please note, it's juxtaposed to this kind of shrine as well. So this kind of centrality of Catholicism. So, Hollein creates this minimal environment that you can see on the left-hand side for the Biennale of the Young, and again, sort of kind of comparing that kind of ideas are coming from space travel, which Hollein is always alluding to at the time as well. And he said, this project provided all necessary equipment for the physical and psychic needs of a human being by means of various media like TV, light, and olfactory conditioning, and constant preservation of the body temperature. Energy inlets and waste disposals can be connected to provided systems. This totally mobile unit can be grouped together and finally also used as a coffin. And when I first started doing my PhD, I was sort of starting to grapple with these kind of minimal environments. I was presenting this at our PhD conference, and people said, well, how is this any different from archigramms, sort of little capsules? Well, I don't think archigram ever talks about having, having to go to the toilet, that this minimal environment is also a toilet, or that people might die, and then it's just this minimal environment becomes this kind of coffin as well. I mean, this is really not, there's something else going on. This is not what archigram is doing. So then he suggests that connectivity can replace architecture altogether, and in line of the COVID and what we've all been having to go through, and even today we're doing this kind of Zoom connectivity. Anyway, there was the Vienna University was considered to, being overcrowded, and they wanted to do an extension. And so Hollein's proposal was in 1966 was to just connected to the TV. And so he writes, no need to go to university if it is overcrowded. No need to build more physical space. Just plug in your television and learn. And you can do this during pandemics as well. But this is also very visionary for 1966. So finally, he starts building. 1966, he built his kind of first real building. And this is the Reti candle shop. You have this hoarding around it. It's in the center of Vienna, very close to the Hofburg, the palace of the Kaiser. And you have this hoarding, and so it's being announced by these space girls. Here about Hans Hollein. Here Hans Hollein is building, so that's what we know, but we can't see what's actually going on. When the hoardings come down, it looks like this. It's nothing like any of the other shop fronts. So usually, the idea is to get maximum glazing. Hollein didn't want that. He basically clads the whole thing in aluminium. There's a very narrow sort of entrance area, and he controls the vision of the product for sale. That's sort of directed, like if you're coming down the street from this way, you see this little window, and from the other, you see that little window. And what's on display? A candle, one little candle. And so Hollein was explaining is that once you have seen one white candle, you basically have the idea of what the shop is about. So you don't need to show 100. And then you go inside, and they're all sort of magnetic, there's lots of mirrors, and you see hundreds and hundreds and endless candles as well. But this was very controversial. And then, so he finally perceives also the idea that the body itself is an environment, and in various permutations, also the female body is an environment and an experience. Here you have another sort of project, little project of his from 1967 called the Non-Physical Environmental Control Kit, where he says the kit will contain different pills which will create various desired environmental situations, such as Love Without Fear, the birth control pill having just been sort of launched. King, well, that's the kind of pill that makes you feel really very big. Happiness, death, very cynical Austria, and suicide rates, and you can just put an end to it all. Then 36.4 degrees Celsius, constant body temperature, which he's also, that's very architectural, that's where his interest in sort of minimal environments and spacesuits comes in. Then 91, 56, 91, the dimensions of Miss Austria. And then finally, Wiener Schnitzel with potatoes and mixed salad. If that doesn't make you feel that good, you can take a pill for that. And finally, we all know aspirin. But it's also about the media of architecture. And from 1965 to 70, he becomes a co-founder and contributor to the newly relaunched Bau magazine that you can see all the covers here. Up here is still the last old Bau magazine, and then all these covers. And you can see that they don't really look like your normal standard architecture publication. Is clearly something that which still today looks more like this thing here. And the motto was everything is architecture and visionary, pioneering and concrete. Hollein was not the only one doing this. There was Günther Feuerstein, Walter Pichler, Sokrates Dimitriou, Gustav Peichel and Oswald Oberhuber that were part of this team of relaunching this. But a lot of the ideas that Hollein had and was developing were he was publishing them within this forum and using media as a very important kind of ingredient of architectural ideas and dissemination. So the content of the publication also intersected with the advertisement, which is kind of intriguing. And I've already mentioned Svoboda to you with with those balloons that could cross borders and bring messages of peace. And these are the back pages, the back cover of some of the Bau magazines, where you can see the atomic mushroom on the one side, and on the other side, the astronaut in his kind of minimal environment, body regulation of body temperature. So these kind of new parameters of architecture that the Austrians were so closely experiencing between the apocalypse and space travel. Finally, within this publication, Hollein, of course, is able to really disseminate his own ideas. And his idea of alles ist Architektur, or everything is architecture, which he writes as a major manifesto and then publishes here as well. And then on the inside, he's of this kind of idea of everything is architecture. He then suggests that perhaps everybody is also can be an architect. And so we have on here Louis Trenke, who studied architecture but then became an actor and film director making Nazi propaganda films. We have Max Frisch from Switzerland, also studied and practiced architecture but then became this major playwright and novelist. André Courrèges from France studied civil engineering but then became a fashion designer and is credited for having invented go-go boots and the miniskirt. And Simon Wiesenthal, who studied architecture before being sent to the concentration camp because he was Jewish and surviving the horrendous experience, he then went on to become a celebrated Nazi hunter and writer, and also him being Austrian. And finally, of course, Arvid Speer, who we more conventionally know, studied and practiced architecture, but also became the Minister of Armaments and War Production for Hitler under the Nazi regime, and then was charged with major war crimes at the Nuremberg trials. But here you can also see where photo hier einkleben, which means you can stick your own photograph in this space and decide if you're an architect or not. Say. So just to kind of just a short excerpt, and this is also my translation of his manifesto, Everything is Architecture. So he writes, limited and traditional definitions of architecture and its means have lost their validity. Today, the environment as a whole is the goal of our activities and all the media of its determination. TV or artificial climate, transportation or clothing, telecommunication or shelter. The extension of the human sphere and the means of its determination go far beyond a built statement. Today, everything becomes architecture. Architecture is just one of these media. Among the very different media which today determine our behavior and our environment, also a solution to certain problems, architecture is one option. Architects must stop thinking only in structures. A building could just as well be simulated. A real architecture of our time is therefore in the process of redefining itself as a medium and also expanding the realm of its resources. Many areas outside the field of building reach into architecture, as in turn architecture and architects embrace other areas. Everyone is an architect. Everything is architecture. So here Hollein is in the architecture bubble. And I love this image. So there's the architecture bubble. He's practicing architecture. That's the way people, we all know that on drawing boards. We sat there and that's what he's doing. He also has a little telephone in there. The whole thing is actually a vacuum cleaner that's being turned around and pushes air into the bubble rather than sucking air out. But I like this image because it also shows this whole kind of performance as a media spectacle, which he was clearly interested in. And indeed, Hollein's work was incredibly fragmented and interdisciplinary. And by the late 1960s, he opened up the field of architecture as a practice that included media, politics, infrastructure, and the human body. And for him, everything and everyone had become architecture and an architect. This 1969 bubble as this media spectacle, but how did Hollein get himself into this bubble? So essentially, Hollein's preoccupations were to do with the human body and its control through technology, but also religion, Catholicism in his instance, telecommunication, media, the rural-urban divide of Vienna, and the Austrian identity. So I think for a lot of people, this kind of idea that there was this intersection of the avant-garde with Catholicism is perhaps slightly foreign and possibly even slightly alienating. So I'll just quickly try to explain this. So here you can see one of my press images, and this is in Vienna. There's some kind of a religious procession going around, and you can see that these are young men. They don't look like they're particularly fringe in terms of geekiness, or they look like people that are very proud to be young Austrian men and to be carrying Jesus around the city. So this is something that's part of everyday culture. That's not something that's been pushed on the side or people are embarrassed about. So back to Otto Mauer, and returning to the Galerie St. Stephan that I had already previously mentioned, and which was so formative for Hollein's interdisciplinary practice. And curiously, the Austrian avant-garde was very closely linked to the Catholic Church, and this context is very important. The foremost gallery, the Galerie St. Stephan, was run by this Catholic priest. In 1954, the passionate, progressive, and often very unpopular Monsignore Otto Mauer had been assigned as the priest to the St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. And he immediately decided to grasp this opportunity and bring together his two passions. One, of course, was the Catholic Church, but the other was art. And he made it his personal and professional mission to reestablish the connection between the two. So until the 19th century, art had been, after all, the Catholic Church's most successful communication device. To Mauer, art was a kind of prophecy that had nothing to do with mere representation. It embraced the vision of the apocalypse. It was a court and judgment over the world, and thus reflected in its reality. When Mauer became familiar with the art informel during his travels in France in the 1940s and 50s, this must have been like a revelation to him. It pulled together a lot of his ideas that sort of instinctively he'd been developing. he was already convinced that the end of the time was near. The atomic bomb and the industrial scale slaughter of World War II had extinguished any positive idea of modernity in a quasi-apocalypse. And the most recent past confirmed to Maurer that the final stage of mankind had already started. He understood the developments in contemporary art as worldly seismographs. So for him, they were just more evidence of this kind of final stage. So by as early as 1952 and 53, Maurer was mentoring a group of young artists who were approaching art in precisely this way and independently from the developments in France. While not explicitly doing Christian art, these painters were not against working within the Catholic context, and the gallery that Maurer had opened in 1954 was to be a location of interdisciplinary exchange, bringing church and art together, but also acting as a forum for discussion within architecture, literature, and performance. It became the most important meeting point for the young artists in Vienna. But what Maurer had hoped would be a place for intellectual dialogue in the service of reuniting religion and art quickly developed a dynamic of its own beyond the priest's control. So while the Monsignor stood by mesmerized, the general public and also the Catholic Church were just scandalized by the artistic content and the debauchery of the artists that were happening within the gallery that was right next to the cathedral and shared the name. Hans Hollein was associated with the gallery, as I mentioned very early on, from 1956, and his output, as I've also explained, was never fixed, and his architecture intersected with art. But Otto Maurer was also very interested in the physical environment of the church as an architecture. So he's also interested in architecture. And the incentive of Vatican II was the opening of the church to its laity, and this also required new spaces for worship and changes in architecture. The Catholic space was manifest in architecture, but also in its ritual, heightened senses, sound, and performance. And as such, there are clear parallels to the action environments of artists who were performing and exhibiting themselves in the latter half of the 1960s. Also the work of Joseph Beuys, for example. Architecture was implicated in the developments of the gallery, and the gallery influenced architecture in return. Hollein organized and curated many exhibitions and held several lectures at this venue. Over the years, he was able to test his own ideas about architecture and was not just a house and a shelter, but was about politics, science, infrastructure, religion, and sex. But above all, he came to the conclusion that architecture is about communication and media. Architecture was everything, and everything was architecture. Already by 1956, the four artists that were closely associated with the gallery, Arnold Freiner, Markus Prachensky, Josef Mickel, and Wolfgang Hollein, formed a group called the Gruppe St. Stephan, and they considered themselves the foremost Viennese artists and wanted to raise the profile of Viennese art scene internationally from the kind of geographically and culturally peripheral position of Austria. The gallery became a place where the group's exhibitions were interspersed with international art of the same style and in a constant rotation. And the resident artists were able to exhibit internationally in return. That was really good for them, but there was very little opportunity for Austrian painters to exhibit there. Aside from them, they had been virtually blocked by the setup. The most this almost sort of incestuous situation brought forward a unique Austrian avant-garde scene in the 1960s that, unlike other developments in the US, for example, or in England, were also closely linked to Catholicism's preoccupation with the body, the cross, and suffering, the passions of the crucifixion. But here in this image, just to point out, this is their art, but this is also a cruciform in the background. So this is Rudolf Schwarzkugler's figure called the Crucified. The Viennese art scene was at a real point of transition when in the early 1960s, the Vienna Actionists appeared on the scene. Their art clearly linked to the previous developments, but were also an immense leap forward, and the body in torment was at its core. Otto Murl, who was a member of this movement, has suggested that the lack of contact, the cultural isolation of Austria, that Austria existed in led to their particular iteration. And he recalls that the actionists only ever heard about new art movements elsewhere, but never actually saw them. And in retrospect, he interpreted the Viennese actionism as a misunderstood happening. In any case, the actionists had themselves set out to become painters and had attended art schools. Hermann Nitsch initially wanted to become a church painter, but he was also very interested in poetry and drama. A critique of Catholicism was central, and particularly Rudolf Schwarzkugler, who created this work, already integrated architecture as environments into his scripts and sort of action scores by 1966. The Vienna actionists were initially regarded as outsiders. Two of the group were not from Vienna. They had come from the rural Alpine provinces, which was considered ignorant and primitive by the tight-knit world of the Viennese art establishment. And while they were present at the art openings of the Monsignore's gallery and admired in particular the work of Arno Freiner, the actionists were blocked from exhibiting by this exclusive arrangement that I've just explained. Their shocking performance-based public spectacles were very much a revolt against the status quo of elitism at the gallery. They conceived themselves as doing a kind of anti-Mauer art. The art that erupted from their forced isolation in the early 1960s might be described with the nouns suffering, mortification, pain, passion, ecstasy, and epiphany. Having grown out of the void and deprivation of the interwar years, it embraced the surreal, Dadaism, and the manifesto, but their sources were the rituals of Catholicism, a longing for and simultaneous rejection of the religious, and also a rediscovery of the Catholic theater and its hysteria, the artist as a kind of martyr. In 1968 was the year of cultural turmoil, and the dissatisfaction of the Austrian radical artists and architects of this area was also manifest. But in this country, the student revolts were generally less revolutionary than elsewhere, possibly because, unlike, for example, in West Germany, a critical reappraisal of its Nazi past was blatantly lacking, and also because communism seemed a dubious alternative to the status quo being so close to the borders and the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union's occupation of part of Austrian territories from 1945 to 55 had shown a violent underbelly that was not enticing as an alternative. So, the actionists at the university in Vienna. Some students in Vienna protested against their professors who were still unashamed Nazis, but the strongest dissent was within the art scene, expressed by the Vienna actionists through shocking and explicit artistic practice rather than political demonstrations and violent street riots as elsewhere. The crescendo of the Austrian student revolt of that year took place in the form of an art performance. The Socialist Student Association organized as a teach-in called Art and Revolution in a university lecture theater on the 7th of June, 1968, was a collaboration with the Vienna actionists who performed public obscenities while singing the Austrian national anthem. The participants were arrested and tried in consequence. Theirs was not about sentiments of solidarity with similar and radical groups in West Germany or elsewhere, or directed against foreign politics such as the Vietnam War. Hermann Nitsch professes that the actionist outrage was not politically motivated, but about the artist's despair about being sidelined and ignored by the artists associated with the Galerie St. Stephan. So, the critique of the Austriennale. Back to where we started. The Milan Triennale in 1968 had not escaped that year's student protests raging throughout the Western world. Opening on the 30th of May 1968, it was sacked instantly, only to reopen again a month later following a cleanup and repairs. And German magazine Der Spiegel reported 1 hour after its opening, a revolutionary committee of Europe declared the most important design exhibition as dead. Ironically, it had sought to address the global problems that had been causing so much discontent among the young people. Here you can see the opening sort of installation. At the exhibition, the protest barricade had itself become an art project that you can see here, but prior to its occupation, This installation of debris, including paving stones, tires, and broken television sets and washing machines by Andrea Di Carlo, Marco Bellocchio, and Bruno Caruso, was situated near the exhibition entrance and was envisaged as a reception desk. The irony was not intended, but the rising students and artists had taken affront to this exhibition in particular and subsequently dismantled it. They found it upsetting and just patronizing. This protest followed those at the Cannes Film Festival and Pesaro, and was officially about the disenfranchisement of Italian students with political and cultural establishments, and has ubiquitously been interpreted as a political action by other scholars. But curiously, the Austrian architects that were present at the Trionary disagree with this interpretation, explaining that this particular Italian unrest is having to do with personal jealousies between the sculptor brother Arnaldo and Gio Pomodoro and the architects and designers in the exhibition. These two affluent artists had joined the students and appeared at the Palazzo door in their Maseratis. So here you can see the first floor of the exhibition. In terms of the protest action, I would like to refer back to the intimate and uniquely Viennese context I've just discussed, and with the actionists and so on, and the link to Hollein's pavilion with this work of people like Rudolf Schwarzkogler. By the end of the 1960s, architecture in Austria had changed, and the list of architectural exhibitions at the Galerie St. Stephan is testament to this. They catalog show after show where architecture was no longer an isolated subject matter discussed dryly at slide evenings and lectures. They had become action performances in their own right and learned from the actionists and their action environments. Hans Hollein's body of work during this time and in close proximity to the art gallery can be seen as a crucible where these influences changed the parameters within which architecture could be imagined and then reconstructed and constructed. For him, the human body was intimately linked to the experience of architectural space, as I've explained. And this preoccupation with the human body and its limits was similar to the performances of the actionists, and they, of course, were linked to Catholicism. While Hollein's work acted as a catalyst for change, the artistic developments that came out of the Viennese avant-garde affected his development in a very complicated feedback loop. And so here's the plan, and the Austriennale is right here. You can see this is the Austriennale. And here it is closer up. As I have already explained, the Vienna actionists had developed their shocking performance-based actions as a reaction to the Galerie St. Stephan and the artists that blocked them from exhibiting there. Within Rudolf Schwarzkogler's oeuvre, there's a curious sketch as well as an action script for a pavilion that has been somewhat resilient to interpretation so far, with dates ranging from 1966 to 1969. And here I wish to suggest that these projects could be understood as a critique to the gallery's favorite architect, Hans Hollein. By creating a psychologically dense and troubling environment, albeit in a pop guise, Hollein was entering the territory of the actionists and their art installations. In response, Schwarzkogler created a rude and offensive alternative to the glossy and sexy mainstreaming of Hollein's surrealist top spectacle, making socially and commercially acceptable a conceptual art that was supposed to be based on shock. Schwarzkogler's pavilion. So the action script and drawing by Schwarzkogler are both titled The Consecrated Austrian Pavilion. I contend that they should be interpreted as an explicit critique of the Austriennale and Hollein's maneuvering within the art establishment, his success in exhibiting his work. The project is conceived as an action environment, and as such is very much like Hollein's pavilion and in line with the organizer's request. Both exhibitions areas are basically square, as you can sort of see on this drawing, and with sort of one entrance that is here. The action script reads, this is in German, I'll read it to you in English. The square floor surface is made of pear wood. The walls of glass, the ceiling of aluminum and crossed out in a metal alloy, violet neon tubes, a pile of grass covering 1/5 of the floor surfaces, white sheets, red, white, red cloth flag, tables made of pear wood, bowls, consecrated fish, freshwater fish, trout, and tench cooked in salt water and vinegar, consecrated meat, pieces of goat's meat boiled in salt water, consecrated grain, dried wheat and barley grains, consecrated wine, green Veltliner in small glasses, pears, a bed made of plastic, which you can see here, and it's meant for sexual interaction, which it says very clearly. There's grass and goat skin, and then crossed out it says, for practicing consecrated sexual intercourse, a bed made of, in brackets and crossed out, cloth. So both pavilions were spaces of sexuality. Schwarzkugler's drawing shows a plastic bed for performing consecrated sexual intercourse, and the critique of Catholicism is explicit by the word also consecrated. While Hollein had the sexy young hostesses animating the space in their red, white, red jumpsuits with these red zippers, wearing the clear red, white, clear red plastic glasses. The proposed glass walls of the Schwarzkugler Pavilion landed in an unsettling edge of voyeurism. Materials such as aluminum, alloys, neon, and plastic were within the Schwarzkugler space were also the materials that Hollein was experimenting with in his pavilion. In terms of the program too, there are other clear parallels, such as the message that this was an Austrian exhibition. Hollein had Austrian glasses produced on site, and Schwarzkugler had the actual red, white, red Austrian flag. Both exhibitions were about Austrian products, whereas Hollein displayed those made by the Austrian industry. Schwarzkugler's were comestibles from the Austrian provinces, such as wine, meat, fish, and fruit. The consecrated Austrian Pavilion by Schwarzkugler can therefore be read as a comment on Hollein's work as being very Vienna-centric, while also addressing the Triennale's theme about that dichotomy between urban and rural disparity that was being exacerbated by modernity. Evidence from Hollein's personal archive corroborates this, suggesting that some far more troubling action environments had been under consideration by Hollein, and as such. So here we can see sort of a long hallway with this kind of red door, and then the telephone, this kind of connectivity that's always very important to him. And then another sketch shows another corridor where we're basically looking down on a toilet, you know, this idea of the body, all of its different kind of functions. Then we have another corridor with, you know, with a Nazi flag and fragments. And this very troubling, you know, Austrian complicity. And then finally, as a drawing that's, you know, as an early proposal also for the Milan Triennale, this idea that the walls would be glass and would be slicing a human body. So what was Hollein's pavilion really about? Was it complicit or was it subversive? Rediscovering the nation's cultural and historic specificity beyond a Nazi agenda, or the commercial or nostalgic imperatives of mass tourism, was crucial to artistic production of Hollein and others. Culturally Catholic, the influx of colonizing influences arriving in Austria via post-war Allied re-education initiatives created during the 1960s unexpected artistic mutations of pop, communication, commodification, Cold War science, and the specter of the apocalypse, while some contributions were also seduced by the extreme escapist option of simply living in a bubble on the moon. These concepts were fused within a typically Austrian attitude which combined cynicism, sex, and the abandoning of limits by an avant-garde that, along with Hollein, was preoccupied with the human body. The Austrian Pavilion at the Triennale in 1968 is of a particular interest because a close reading of its conceptual architecture shows so clearly the complex intersections of the Viennese art avant-garde and even architectural avant-garde. While it was in so many ways responding to the traumatic conditions of the first half of the 20th century by putting forward its own specifically Austrian cultural reassessment, it also provoked a strong and radical response by the Vienna actionist Rudolf Schwarzkugler, who proposed his own alternative action environment for the pavilion as a theoretical and unrealized project. Even though at first glance, the Hollein exhibition space looks like a fun and funky pop environment, the installation can thus be read as a site of artistic and political protest. Encapsulating the aspirations and fears of the European avant-garde against the backdrop of US hegemony, Catholicism, and Cold War anxiety, it became itself a fertile cauldron for art, architecture, exhibition design, and critique. So in the end, my story about Hans Hollein and his Austriennale Pavilion is much more culturally nuanced than simply a discussion on the parameters of just another architectural exhibition. It is about architecture as an interdisciplinary environmental practice, but also about Hollein's attempt to help resituate through this exhibition how Austria's cultural identity in the post-war era might be understood. Thank you.
One of the things, Eva, I was wondering about in terms of Hollein's impact more broadly. Thinking about this idea of the exhibition as a political act or as a performance as much as anything.
Yeah.
And I've heard Tom Main has made reference to Hollein's exhibition work in particular when he set up the exhibitions in his home in the early days of SciArc in Los Angeles. And I've also heard Dylan Scafido talk about Hollein, and you think about, again, the early days of their practice. Think of any other architectural practice, necessarily contemporary practice that's used the exhibition as a medium that intensely. So I'm just, given your scholarship along, I mean, have you considered that in terms of this broader impact on architectural discourse? And because I mean, there is this issue of the 80s where things go quiet, whether that's, and I mean, I think you in your book suggest that maybe the exhibition of deconstructivism in MoMA is a turning point in a way.
Yeah. I mean, I think what sort of, you know, as soon as architecture just tries to explain itself through the concept of style, this, through my research, became very problematic. Yeah. Because it just ossifies things. And you're not talking about, I mean, I've been also teaching about, you know, modernism as a style and postmodernism as a style and, you know, deconstruction and all that stuff. And as soon as we need to be understanding these things as movements. As long as we understand them as movement, they still develop, they literally move around and exhibit themselves, and ideas move around. But as soon as it becomes a style, that's often, I mean, also to do with publication, the MoMA exhibitions, publications, the work of Charles Jencks, publications. It's something that media publication is much easier to deal with style, which is easy to look at, pictures that respond to this, and then a very easy message, rather than kind of the complication of a movement that is changing and developing all the time. And so, where perhaps exhibition can play a more active role as well.
And we'll move to other people, but I'm interested in this thing of moving from, because I'm curious about this, particularly with Dylan Scafido as well, moving from exhibition as a medium to building.
Yeah. And
I mean, obviously, Gladbach is a building.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always wondered if
it's an exhibition building.
It is an exhibition building, but I always wondered if I mean, the exhibition in 72, which you've written about in Exhibit A, which encouraged participants to, because the theme of death comes up again, and participants had to, it was like an archaeological dig.
Yeah.
So is that a precursor? I mean, is that him thinking about an idea for a building, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I have another lecture that I could give you on that. I mean, my whole interpretation of that exhibition, the exhibition on death, and which takes place for the people that don't know about this in Mönchengladbach, in the initial museum that was a bourgeois, neo-Gothic bourgeois townhouse, and that just the very new director takes over, Johannes Kladders. There's very interesting counterculture where also these ideas are happening all at the same time. He takes over in 1967. Hollein's exhibition is, I think, 72. And to me, the exhibition that he puts on, which is called an exhibition on death, everything is architecture, where you have a sort of a sand digging field where you're digging around and you're finding kind of contemporary clutter, like a broken Coca-Cola bottle, plastic shapes, various kind of different things that are part of everyday life of 1972. And they are then put on display as a kind of an archaeology of the day and age. But to me, this was a proposal for his later museum. That's when he's given the commission as well. And he starts designing the museum of Tyberg, his own museum, from 72, and it finally is finished in 82. So to me, my analysis of this very odd exhibition, the death of the old museum so that there can be a new museum.
Anyone, any questions from the?
We've got one from Sylvia.
Sylvia. Hello.
Hi, Eva. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I have many questions, but one that I was really thinking of is, what was the selection process for being the designer of the house Triennale? So how was Hollein appointed to that position, given that he started quite in the middle of the 60s to design? So I was wondering, how did he get there?
That's a good question, and I need to look into that. I don't know how he was commissioned, but I mean, the thing was that he was very active in exhibitions also through this Galerie St. Stephan, and for many years, he couldn't build. So he was, doing the shop, he was doing the publications, he was doing exhibitions, lots and lots of different exhibitions, and then was probably known better as an exhibition designer than as an architect. The architecture didn't start coming until later, and indeed when he sort of commissioned 1972 to do the Mönchengladbach Museum, the people say, well, actually when he starts he starts going, he becomes a professor of architecture in Düsseldorf, which is very close to Mönchengladbach. He's voted in by the artists rather than, and the architects are sort of ambivalent, and there's this question, what has he actually built? He hadn't really built very much at all. He hadn't had this opportunity to build anything that fit in with his own kind of ideas. And so he is kind of known as an exhibition designer, basically. And then, a couple of years, there's many exhibitions that he does, and then and sort of performance situations and art installations and this, and so and then he's also teaching. He starts teaching in Düsseldorf, and gets involved. Actually, he gets into Düsseldorf through Josef Beuys, who's an artist, performance artist. So his early career is really centered much more within the art scene. And the architects actually reject him. His exhibition that I was showing you at the Galerie St. Stephan, some of his works just got, the students came in and started destroying the works. There were professors at the universities that forbade the students to actually go and see the exhibition because it was too controversial. And Hollein was very much blocked in Vienna for many years. And that he's kind of accepted in America and works there and is quite popular there. And then he gets this job as a professor in Düsseldorf at the Art Academy there, and then comes back to Vienna the other way around, for getting his reputation internationally.
Thank you.
Okay.
John and Janet both got their hands up.
Well, I was just going to, so I found the process of describing his work as part of a national project quite intriguing when you consider what's happening around the rest of the world at the same time. I mean, France is the Telquel situationists, the student uprisings that shut down the country around the same time.
Yeah.
You showed the images of the student protests in Milan. There's the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations in the US. I just wondered, is there a chance that it's an ironic take on the national project, or do you think he really was very interested in trying to assert a new way of understanding Austrian identity?
It's both. I think the Austrians are, part of the mentality is always slightly cynical and ironic, and they like to make fun of themselves. You know, they know that there's a sort of saying, the Germans say, so situation is serious, but it's not hopeless. And the Austrians say, the situation is hopeless, but it's not serious. You know, this kind of, I mean, this is the difference between Austrians and Germans in this kind of, and so I think, you know, most of the buildings that are being built during the post-war era in the countryside have pitched roofs, and they're kind of kitsch rural fantasies, big hotels catering to the ski industry, you know, this kind of yodeling stuff that we saw. It's on the postcard. That's what a lot of building is. And that's not, you know, the young architects are saying, but, you know, what is that? Isn't that a little bit too close to what kind of the Nazis wanted to have? You know, what is this? And what are we really about? And that, I mean, the whole idea is that Austrian national identity is, I think, at a very precarious point to try to find who they are after Nazism. And with the Nazis still teaching at universities, they were all over the place, so not just in the universities, so they were in positions of power, you know, and so it was really frustrating. So but I think there's this kind of tongue-in-cheek dealing with this really kind of awful situation, but in a kind of a funny way, so that then if you can laugh about it, you can perhaps move through it and you can get more people on board. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It was quite an interesting parallel. Adolf Loos was criticised for a similar thing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Being anti-Austrian, it's letting Austria down to critical. When he's saying, I'm actually more Austrian than the Austrians. If they could only be honest, they'd say, I'm really talking about Austria. Quite interesting that
Yeah.
It's national.
Yeah. I suppose it's something you're thinking about at the moment, because so much of what he was protesting about or anticipating is something that we're still living with and anticipating. It's like you do start to have that sense of hopelessness about the effect of architecture and art practice to make a difference.
Yeah, and it's also sort of a resistance to complacency, and you know, this kind of, perhaps also because there was, you know, this kind of very easy takeover of Austria's part of Nazi Germany, where there was no kind of big movement of criticism, and that these young artists and architects are basically saying, it's not going to happen for us. We need to be critical. If that's the least thing we can do, we will do this. Thank you. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, when I was a student of architecture in the early 70s, Hans Hollein was seen, along with Archiground, along with a number of, I mean, I think of also Raymond Abram and
Yes.
such as well. You know, that there was this, I mean, I think you talked about a kind of actionism, you know, that it wasn't just the product, it was the ideas, it was the way you situated yourself in the world, and certainly issues around the environment and the body as not as a pure form, but one that defecates, one that sweats, it's messy, it's so. And then you have his buildings, which are so postmodern.
Yeah, but that happens.
What happened?
Yeah.
I mean, where did he go? Where did Hans Hollein go
Okay.
to become Hans Hollein?
You know, I mean, I set out to do my PhD on postmodernism initially. I was working in heritage in the UK for many, many years with the 20th Century Society, and that was the next sort of threshold for getting, we were doing brutalism, and I got the Barbican put in the application for the Barbican, for the University of East Anglia, various brutalist things that were quite contentious. And then finally also the Lloyd's building, high tech. That was also my application, et cetera, et cetera. And then sort of the next problematic threshold was going to be a postmodernism. And then I thought, well, I don't really want to work in heritage any longer. I want to teach. And so I finally found a topic that I can do and I understand it. And but of course I didn't really understand it at all. And then first I thought I would do British postmodernism. I very quickly thought that, you know, I've lived in the UK now for 25 years, but I wasn't born there. And I felt like there was some kind of cultural things that I didn't understand. So I thought, well, I'll just, you know, half Austrian. I grew up in Germany, but several times a year we would visit my grandparents who were in the mountains. So I knew all about how they kind of referred and rejected Vienna. I knew much more about the kind of cultural situation there. And then when I'm looking at Hollein's work, and you know, because he was, and I thought, okay, I'll look at Hollein's work. And then I realized when you're looking at anything in the publications, you're like, okay, yeah, there's a postmodernist stuff, but there's all this other stuff. And how's this exactly this question? How's this the same person even? Because it doesn't have a style. And you know, it's collages, it's publications, and you know, all this kind of stuff that I was also showing you. And you think, how does this link in with postmodernism? And then I decided that postmodernism had much more to do with sort of a cultural condition and also with the kind of role of media, how the role that media plays with architecture as well. And but I do feel like then in the sort of there is a point where Hollein, you know, gets considered by Charles Jenks, starts positioning him from the very beginning as a postmodernist when the stuff doesn't even look postmodern. And then at the Venice Biennale in 1980, the first architecture biennale, he's showing his columns. He's not doing one of these facades, but he's taught, his whole exhibition is about facades on the inside, and he showed the Retty Campbell shop and various other shop fronts he's done. But a lot of the other facades are facades. And then Jenks starts changing postmodernism from something that's far more eclectic and also really, you know, just what he explained to me in our many conversations, that he understood postmodernism as a critique of modernism. But then it becomes a style, and you can read that in the AD magazines, in his interviews and his discussions, where it focuses down on the style, and then it becomes about, if it's a style, what does it look like? And rather than a movement, this kind of problem. And then it's the facade, it's recognizable. Then it's all of a sudden it's postmodern classicism, which happens through the Portuguese and his kind of fascination with, well, his whole kind of, as a scholar, he was interested in classical architecture before he was doing this Venice Biennale. So Hollein becomes kind of implicated into this, and then I do feel like, you know, he thinks, oh, I can build this thing. I can do it.
Sometimes he's like almost like a prototype of the architect, isn't he? So imagine, how could you go from 72 professors in the architecture school at Düsseldorf saying, yeah, who is this guy? What's he built? 13 years later, you've got the prescript. I mean, that's almost unthinkable, isn't it? Really, when you think of this, something happens, doesn't it? Think right on, it gets made. He almost gets
He's
made.
getting made.
He's
He's getting made.
Yeah. Forrest Gumpish about it or something like that. When he gets
No, and it's all through the, you know, media. He's so involved in media and realizes the power of media very early on. Yeah. And I think if I, you know, I mean, Jenks himself talked about reception theory in terms of his work with postmodernism. He said, oh, I just put this idea out there, somebody had mentioned it and everybody was hating it. So and then whenever I talked about it, all the students, all the audiences wanted to talk about it. So then I started giving it to them. And I'm just wondering if there's a bit of reception theory happening also with Hollein's work.
Mm-hmm. But the magazine as well. I mean, I think the magazine is a form of dissemination.
Yeah, no, of course, yeah. The Bow magazine, yeah. And that's his ideas, but then.
But it's sort of, I mean, but it would seem to me that the magazine is treated as it's probably not the right terminology, but as a kind of avant-garde project of resistance against the norms of architectural
thinking and even
and then
mediation.
he becomes completely co-opted into providing what is expected.
Yeah.
So it's no longer resistance, it's actually kind of almost like a bourgeois acceptance. It's like, okay, well, life's much easier if I don't try to fight it. I'm just going to go with the flow.
Well, it sort of closes down in 1970.
Yeah.
And so this is when Hollein, is just, coming to Düsseldorf at this time and becoming a, professorship. I mean, the man also wanted to feed his family. I mean, there's also realities that if you don't build, if Austrian was completely rejected, he was sort of blackballed basically. And to be honest, when I first started doing my PhD, and I had a year where I was studying architecture at the Hochschule für Angewandte Kunst, Hollein was there, but I was in another master class with Holzbauer. And so I still have two colleagues that I had contact with, and when I was going to get to interview Hollein, I emailed them and said, oh, let's meet up, blah, 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 I'm doing my PhD on this, blah, blah. And both of them said, why are you doing it on Hollein? And I was asked this even at the Bartlett, why are you doing it on his architecture? Why don't you just stick with the project? And I said, you can't just do that. You have to see the whole thing holistically and in the complexity. And so my PhD was looking at these various kind of outputs. It wasn't just a globalizing every project he's ever done. And I was advised, Adrian said, don't even try to do that. Try to understand these separate things, which I think did make sense. But so in the end, then it comes the house, and it's it's right across from St. Stephen's Cathedral, and the site that was there before was, I think, by Karl Appel, if I'm not incorrect, did the international style Hotel Intercontinental, and so there's this. Because the other building falls down somehow during the war or something. So this gets built and everybody hates this international style building. So it gets to be just demolished because people didn't like it, because it was across from St. Stephen's Cathedral, so central. And then Hollein builds this. And I remember going to Vienna and my sister should be going, Eva, look, there's this new building. It's all exciting. It's by this professor, blah, blah, blah. And then the hoarding comes down. And then I think for a while there was excitement, but then people just started hating it. And it was a terrible, I mean, that's something I probably should also write about. But I was, I've been trying to sort of understand more about all these different other medias that he's working with and how that then feeds into what everybody knows about this kind of other architecture, the postmodernist architecture. When I went to interview him, of course, he said, no, I don't do postmodernism. I have nothing to do with this. And this is Charles Jenks's term, and he does this. He said that I'm this, but this is not me. So,
But is there, sorry, I don't know. Was it?
No, go ahead.
Just, I was interested in, I mean, when you started talking, when you started the talk and you were situating his work as a kind of anti-modernism, or at least anti-internationalism, maybe. I'm wondering, what was his take on other Austrian architects like Loos? I mean, where would he, because Loos is not internationalism. He might be considered a modernist architect, but he's not international.
Yeah,
and then when you think of Neutra or Schindler.
He did see the archive.
Yeah.
And also the Schindler House.
Yeah, so I'm interested in how did he situate those people?
No, not the Schindler. What is that? Yeah, he did Schindler in America. No, it was the philosopher Wittgenstein House. He was part of the campaign that saved the Wittgenstein House. He did kind of also heritage work, so heritage campaigning.
So it's just kind of, I mean, on the one hand, the kind of, actionism and stuff, and being interested in space, being interested in the aircraft carrier, being interested in self-contained environments and everything, has one aspect as a non-international style, style of architecture. But I'm interested if he wrote or discussed, where would he situate someone like Lowe's, Schindler, Neutra,
He-
even Cite or something?
Yeah,
You know,
I
where
mean-
did he see them in the directionality of architecture?
When he was being, as I understand, when he was being educated in this post-war period, there was very little understanding of that because that had been sort of not talked about during the Nazi era.
Right.
So he also said you could just go and buy, artwork by, I don't know, ACAHUCH kind of stuff, very, very cheap. I mean, people didn't know about this they kind of knew about it, but nobody had talked about it for ages, and there was no kind of value to do with these kind of works of the Vienna avant-garde of the turn of the century, which is also, of course, Los happening in the Secession, and that kind of comes back again sort of in the 80s as well. He fixes up also the Austrian Pavilion in Venice. I mean, that was one of his project was, I mean, he does do these other things that are perhaps lesser known, and I've just sort of stumbled into them, but not doing, I wasn't trying to go and look at his role in heritage, but that might be something interesting to look at. I haven't done that yet. I've sort of seen it peripherally. So then when he's in America, he's very interested in Schindler and these, and goes and tries to find them and look at them and writes articles on them.
Right.
And they get published in Bau magazine. So there is this kind of heritage, or sort of this modernist heritage architecture stuff that he is promoting through Bau as well.
I think, I'm not sure about Schindler or Neutra, but one of them, he saved his 35 mil slide collection and took it to MoMA, tried to get MoMA to take it on, and they refused it, and they get stolen in his car. Is it not?
Yeah, they get,
The whole slide collection.
well, yeah, I didn't know about that. This was that. I know that all of his slides got stolen in his car, like an evening before he gets back onto the boat to New York. There are a couple of slides that are in the private archive that were Hollein's photographs of his road trip that he takes. But yeah.
Look, I think we're going to have to wrap up. And look, a huge thank you. And the other thing to say is he was sitting with a shelf of Hans Hollein's 76 exhibition, the first architecture exhibition at Man Transformed. So finally got someone to look at it with a,
Which I've been doing.
yes. So hopefully something might come out of that.
Yeah.
But look, a huge thank you, and thanks for all the people who've stayed online.
Yeah.
Okay.